for uses that apparently do not comply with the terms of the zoning district, and I'll go over that. In the zoning ordinance, under residential scale commercial, it has three provisions that are listed under section 4.9, and the main one that we're talking about here centers on, it says, new restaurants, inns, and other businesses that rely principally on visitors for their clientele shall not be permitted. Okay. And that seems like a straightforward statement, but then when you start picking it apart a little bit, it's pretty apparent that inns rely on visitors, but we've had applicants try to make the case that they want to open a restaurant and their business is not going to rely principally on visitors. It's going to be comprised of locals, and we get that. And then all kinds of other uses that the case is made that relies principally on, not principally on visitors. So, and the two other statements in that zone district section are contained under general conditions. One says uses are encouraged which serve daily needs of the town's residents. Okay. So that's kind of an encouragement statement. And then under the findings or criteria for use permit, these are consistent through every commercial district, but there's one that says the proposed use provides benefits to residents. Okay. Now that same statement appears in primary commercial where inns are allowed, and also in Old Town commercial where inns are allowed. Clearly visitor serving uses. So that becomes a little speculative about what that means. Does it mean in the broadest of sense providing a benefit to residents through TOT, or a direct benefit that it's some daily need thing? So it's kind of open to interpretation, but it does appear in every commercial zone section. So what we have also in the general plan are statements regarding uses that are resident or visitor serving. And one of them establishes Washington Street as the main street, where the heart of the town, traditional Main Street, these terms are used, where, and I quote, additional visitor-oriented commercial uses are permitted and areas where residents serving commercial businesses will be encouraged. Also goes on to contain the idea that visitor-oriented businesses also provide some benefit to town residents. And then finally, it has a statement that says the needs of residents supports only a few small local serving businesses. So there's kind of the idea a little bit all over the terrain there of what it is. Through these statements, you could advance the notion that they recognize and acknowledge that our population is only capable of supporting a few small businesses. However, on the other hand, you could contrariwise make the argument that they're calling for businesses that are of benefit to residents and resident serving. So the question that we would like to discuss and was discussed by the council is primarily in the residential scale commercial zone district, this idea of restricting uses and excluding uses that rely on visitors principally for their clientele. I also want to note that the term residential scale commercial, it is discussed in the zoning and design ordinance, and it really refers to not so much the use, but the way the buildings are designed and sited and the size of the buildings. And they're trying to achieve a design that it creates this buffer between the residential areas to the east And if you look on our zoning map and you see towards the right side of the map, all of the residential areas, and then that purple is the residential scale commercial, and that's kind of a thin buffer of commercial uses fronting on Washington Street that have a different, call for a different size and type of design of building that is more complementary and harmonious with the residential buildings and don't overwhelm the residential buildings. And I suppose the latest example of that would be if you compare Summerston building, and in the background is a new residence, Davino residence. They're essentially of a similar scale and even design materials. So that was a notion there in residential scale commercial, it's referring to the size of the buildings that are allowed. But we're talking here about uses, and I should point out that there's no there's no motivation or no reason to get into changing any of the design aspects of that zoning district. That's not really under consideration. We're talking more about the uses allowed in the zone district, and we'll leave all of the design qualities that presently exist for that zone district untouched and unaltered. Those aren't on the table. In the staff report, there's some information that was presented for consideration and discussion. One of it is we're talking about something, a zone district is essentially built out. So how elaborate this discussion and rulemaking needs to be, subsequent rulemaking, that should be held up against the magnitude of the problem facing us. We've got one lot vacant next to Ranch Market, and that's kind of it for the residential scale commercial. There will possibly be replacement buildings in that zone district, and those would come into play, but none known at this point. Also, some information about how reliant we are on visitors in all of our businesses and where we derive our revenues from. When you total up the TOT and sales tax, 75% of our revenue is derived from, could be traced back to visitors. 50 amount. We don't really define when it calls for this statement, and this is the key statement in all of this, is that new restaurants and other businesses that rely principally on visitors for their clientele shall not be permitted. The point is that we have no means to determine whether a business is relying on visitors or not relying on visitors. There's no metric, no measurement. We don't know who is and who isn't and to what degree they are or are not. But there's been a lot of discussion at the council meeting and confessions, admissions, whatever, by businesses that you would think are clearly resident serving, Ranch Market, and Eric Housley has stated that they rely on visitors, that their business that's an essential component of their business. And then it got into a whole consideration of, well, what business in town does not rely on visitors, really, and could survive? We do not, also, for your information, and you may already know this, but we don't get any interest other than as far as people, potential business operators coming to the town with proposals of opening a new business that are not what would be considered visitor serving in nature. A lot of wine tasting, of course, lately. We don't, in the last, well, I've been here going on 9 years, and I can't think of in the last at least 8 years, anyone coming into town saying, I want to open up something that you would say was a resident serving, like a bookstore or a clothing store or a shoe store, we just do not get that kind of interest, and it may have to do with the structure of per square foot cost of retail here in town. They could not be supported by the 2,200 people and the 1,100 veterans we have and the outlying county residents to support a shoe store or any one of those kinds of stores. So we just don't get the question asked. No one's coming in wanting to do that. We do get the other. We get the mainly wine tasting lately, restaurants occasionally. And then the last one here is the notion that if we do devise a definition of what local serving is, it most likely will mean some type of government intervention that's going to shape the market and be counter to the market as we've experienced the market to be. And if you had a shopping center that, say, the restriction was, and you came up with a definition of what's local and what's visitor serving, and say you can have 50% or arbitrary figure of each. And so by that action, the government has devalued half of the square footage in the sense that the property owner would have to lower the per square foot costs in order to make that work for a type of business that would probably be considered local serving. So there's that factor, I suppose. In the staff report, it goes on and had some talking point issues for discussion of is our population sufficient in size to support resident serving as they, however, may be defined. Are they viable in our market scenario with the high demand on our limited commercial space and the per square foot cost? What retail or other uses are economically viable which do not include some reliance on tourists? What would those uses be? Just coming up with a list of what resident serving means is difficult. Do we want to restrict any new restaurant of any type? Do we want to restrict additional wine tasting rooms? Now, one thing I will say is when this discussion got going, it was very much wrapped up in wine tasting uses wanting to locate in the residential scale commercial zone. And it got off on a whole kind of sidebar discussion of wine tasting rooms in general. Do we have too many? Not enough? Do we need to cap them? And that's taken on a discussion separate from this. So we can maybe not get so much into the wine tasting part of this, and that we already had that discussion for the ZDRB, and we'll be continuing the discussion at the council. So just know that. And you'll see in the staff report mention of wine tasting, and this was back when it was sort of linked up with what can happen in RSC. The question of do not all local uses rely on visitors for their clientele to a significant extent? Budget funding levels being adequate and the need to provide into the future for with one eye on keeping our visitors having uses that will interest visitors for them to come here and keep our long-term revenues healthy. And then some of these other are more rhetorical, I suppose. What will we do differently? The build-out question with the few parcels, with the one parcel we have, really. And at time of, if it, this could take on a thing where, and it does, people that come to town and want to invest in town, they are not really up for, the real estate is priced as it is to the market right now. And to then be subsequently told, well, now you've got some restrictions that are going to limit the types of uses you can have in there. It's kind of messing with the real estate market in that sense, or complicating the real estate market. And someone purchasing a piece of property in good faith of an expectation of what could happen in that property. And right now, there's an uncertainty of what visitor serving means. And in the business community, they like certainty, and that's where we're trying to go with this, is to take it one way or the other and provide that certainty. So part of the suggestions were, alternatives for discussion, was to continue with the prohibition of new inns and restaurants, just any kind of restaurant, no qualification that they're for residents or anyone else, that it's just no new restaurants in RSC, no new inns in RSC. And that also has to do with probably the number of restaurant seats we already currently have being perhaps viewed as adequate and satisfactory for the balanced against the number of inn rooms we have. Also, there is the question of the RSC or the consideration of RSC being against, juxtaposed directly against residential uses, and the types of uses that happen on those properties. Some may have a greater impact in terms of noise on the adjacent residential. So I think where we were going was to disqualify inns and restaurants, and then perhaps just take the question straight on of excluding the entire question of trying to come up with a visitor serving definition and not have that qualification. It would be any type of use that the market would present and could support. And then I have included an assessment of the need to impose a retail diversity overlay requirement for any proposed use during the use permit review of new retail. Now, that notion was extending the retail diversity beyond wine tasting. If we wanted to try to co-opt a business that were and have other products that may be of interest to locals, we have implemented that with the wine tasting rooms, and there's more discussion to be had on that, on the degree that needs to be increased, perhaps. But in the case of the wine tasting rooms, it was more of the idea of a monoculture use that was going into every available retail space and having other types of diverse retail along with it. And then finally, if we do indeed want to stick with the notion of local serving, we would need to adopt suitable criteria. So the town council had a discussion, and there were some ideas that came out of that, and they're summarized in the staff report. There was the idea of incentives being offered if we can define what's local serving and offering incentives to provide that. And then that gets very difficult as well. It could be a sales tax or property tax rebate. However, for a limited period of months. But it was pointed out that this presents a problem of subsidizing one business over another and giving that business a competitive edge because they happen to come in at that point in time. and we're willing to do the incentives. I suppose it could work retroactively to any business that's even operating currently could avail themselves of incentives if they provided uses within the definition of resident serving. And then there's also the notion if it's a new building, and we're not going to get many of those as we've already, or a rebuilt building. This one I'm least in agreement with, and it's a one-shot zoning standard, flexibility where you get more height, less yards, or more FAR, reduced parking standard, where we start relaxing zoning standards. But the reason I'm against that is that lasts forever, as long as the building at least is there, and uses come and go. So just know that. Otherwise, incentives, it's apparently a monetary incentive of some type of rebate was what was suggested for providing what would be whatever we define as local serving. So that may be enough information for you to launch the discussion. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I have a question to start off with. How much does it actually cost in fees? Say the property next to Ranch Market wants to be developed. How much does the town end up actually collecting in fees for doing all the permitting and everything?
Well, there's a whole slate of fees. We have impact fees for new buildings that, and there's a list of them. They're in a spreadsheet, and they kind of get crunched out. But they have to do with public safety and water, sewer.
How about like a gross estimate? Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands?
Well, it's keyed into the type of use. There's fees for commercial square footage. If it's a restaurant, it's seats, and if it's an inn, it's rooms. In this case, it will probably be commercial square footage. And we're talking probably a couple $100,000 in that case, somewhere in that neighborhood.
So that's how much the town ends up collecting on a development like that.
Well, those are impact fees, and they go towards the specific impact, parks, rec, traffic, yeah. So, and then there's additional fees for the building permit itself to build the building and have the plan checked, and engineering fees.
Entitlement fees too.
So for a $1 million project, 20% of that goes to fees, or 20% over that? So you're paying $1,200,000.
No, it's not so much.
Is it the percentage that high of what a project is?
It's not tied to like $1 million. It's tied to the amount of square footage.
Yeah, but I'm maybe 2,000, 3,000 square foot projects, $1 million. So you're saying that 20%, the fees that the town will collect are 20% of the cost, more or less.
In that example.
I mean, in that example, it's a crude example, but I mean, I'm just trying to, project may cost $2 million. I don't know how much Summerston costs, but those are pretty high fees. They seem to be to me.
Isn't it true that you're required to calculate those fees based on a real relationship to the actual cost of providing the service?
Right.
It's not just, we're going to charge you $50,000 because you want a new sewer connection. You're required to have some sort of reasoning behind it,
Right.
tying it to the actual cost of providing the service, whether it be...
Yeah, in 2005, the town hired a consulting firm that did that very thing, and our fees were undervalued for the services we were providing. We weren't collecting enough fees for affordable housing and all kinds of things. And they did the study, and that's when those fees the new impact fees were adopted.
So
And we are not, we're certainly within the range of what every other municipality is charging. We're not extraordinarily high.
I guess my point is not that trying to figure out if we're high or low, or is how much we end up actually collecting. Because if we're talking about financial considerations of where we could incentivize things, would be a reduction in fees. So I was trying to see if that's actually worthwhile, or if there were enough fees collected to make that worthwhile for somebody to do something. And it sounds like there are.
In regards to the different fees, I think there's an opportunity for entitlement fees. That's something that perhaps could be discounted. But as Jason mentions, the impact fees are really intended to cover costs. So if we're
And the
discounting
entitlement
those-
fees as well, the plan reviews and whatnot need to be tied to.
Right, but also saying we're reducing taxes. I mean, the town's going to, in that concept, we're doing something to subsidize it, whether it's reduction of fees, whether it's discount on taxes. I understand that that's tied to a certain amount that we end up having to pay for that. But I mean, we could still discount it and say, well, you don't have to pay for the sewer, or you don't have, or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, take affordable housing, for instance, and that was in the housing element a priority for the town to assist that to happen, the construction of affordable housing. And it's built into our housing element that we assist in fee relief. And it happened in the entitlement portion. They still had to get a building permit and pay those fees, impact fees. So if the town makes it a priority, then it could happen. That's a little separate from, relief or a rebate on sales tax, property tax. I don't think we can really do much in the way of property tax, since that's a county
We don't do that.
assessment.
I had a question, Bob. So, at the end of our discussion this evening, what would you like to come away from this meeting with? A clarity on local serving, yay or nay? What uses are permitted and not permitted in residential, commercial overlay? What's the?
Residential scale commercial.
commercial.
Right.
You want a sort of direction or decision on that? If you want us to say black or white, yes or no?
Well, I would like to know your thoughts on the types of uses you feel would absolutely should not be allowed in RSC. And just for everyone's information, the RSC zone district starts as you come into town. It's on the right side there, on the east side. And
At the bank.
Yeah, at the bank, and extends up to where, what is that?
Gates
Mulberry
Estates.
Street. No?
Humboldt.
We just added to that with Gates and the Rossi lot. And on the other side, it
Washington Street.
goes up to where Bistro Gentil is, and, on Washington there, before it takes the Y. And the Antique Fair.
Which Rossi lot? Which
South of
Rossi?
Gates Estates,
Oh, yeah, okay.
between Gates and
So then it does,
Edward James.
so it goes up to the post office, so Bistro Gentil, and then it skips over the community center, and then it begins at Hurley's and goes up the east side of the street for that block
Yes,
to Gates,
yes.
and that's it.
So your thoughts on uses that should not be permitted, your thoughts on the feasibility of requiring what would be termed, and I don't know the definition, and that would lead to that question, requiring what would be termed resident serving. And if that's the direction that's deemed we should go in, then we would need to figure out what that means and define that term. If you are in your assessment of the belief that it's somewhat, given the composition of the town, the population of the town, the the type of economy we have that's tourist-based, that it's not feasible to require a use to be principally resident serving, or contrariwise not relying principally on visitors, then we don't need to get into those definitions, I suppose, and those tests of what it makes up a resident serving or relying principally on visitors. So that whole question of your assessment of the feasibility of perpetuating a system that requires that. And then your thoughts on should there maybe not be the requirement, but incentivize trying to attract those types of businesses and what those incentives would be. If you had any suggestions or ideas.
Did you have any questions?
I have a comment, an opinion, I guess. I think, to me, the question is more, rather than locals versus tourists and all this, which seems kind of emotional and kind of divisive in a way, I think it should be the objective of this board and the town to support businesses that are going to be economically viable and sustainable, no matter what their source of revenue is. I just still don't really see a lot of local market here. We've pounded the demographics issue into the ground over the few times I've been in these meetings, and I think of like the farmers market that we used to have here. It was fun, and everybody would go up there and they'll be all excited and everything. But it didn't happen. They went out of business. There wasn't enough local support. Nobody wanted to pay the prices. They ended up going down 6 miles down the road and getting their produce and so on. And the farmers who were here, no middleman involved, there's a chance to support your local merchant, they moved on. And why would it be any different whether it be an ice cream store, a Subway, a shoe store, whatever local serving parameter you want to throw out there? I just don't see it happening here. I think the focus and the responsibility, at least as I take it, is to create sustainable economic opportunities for investors who want to come in here, spend serious money, put serious money into the towns for entitlements, permitting, you name it, reports, studies, all that's required to turn a spade, and make sure that they're successful and they contribute to the longevity of their business and the cash flow to the town and their own investments. And I just think that the whole conversation about locals, tourists, it's divisive and inconsequential in the long run because the demographics don't support it. I don't see it. If I'm missing it, please correct me, but I don't see it.
I would say if there was a yay or nay vote on that phrase, local serving, I would vote to just strike it from our documents. I just think that we, as Bob said, we've discussed this so much, and we've reached out to try to come up with some definitions of what those uses might be, and they don't exist. People can get in their car and drive 9 miles south of here and go to Napa and get all the resident serving needs that they have. They're not going to get it here.
They're not going to get it here.
So I just think that at the time the plan was written, it was a noble kind of cause, and we've seen over the years it just hasn't panned out. And you can see it in trying to impose on these tasting rooms that component within their use. They're struggling with it, and they're certainly not getting any support from, I don't think, from the locals in terms of going in there, the retail diversity part of it. So I would say, it was an idea that was noble at one time, and I think its time has passed. I think that we shouldn't be looking at every project in terms of trying to make that work. That's just my feeling at this point, because we've gone through this a lot.
So I have a couple more questions before I want to be really clear. One is, what is the health of our inns in town? Do we have a clear grasp of that? I mean, before we say we've maxed out on numbers of rooms or seats or anything like that, what is the health? I mean, if every room is full every night, which I know it's not, but I'd feel like it wouldn't make sense to then limit whether inns could come into town from a business side of things. So is there any idea of the health of our
Oh,
inns?
a very precise idea. We know occupancy, we know through our TOT numbers. And it was, of course, after the economic downturn that corresponded to that, and was not what it was prior to that. But it's been recently steadily rebounding. I don't have specific numbers, but seems to be improving.
Like 75% occupancy, or any number that you could share, or is it confidential?
I don't have a number. I know that, well, those are more tied into the finance, but I think we up into the 80s even a little bit. We've had some under construction and just opened, and so they're just getting established, but generally they're fairly healthy.
Could the question be rephrased to, are occupancy levels near what they were 2.5 years ago?
I would have to return with that information.
Okay.
If the idea of that, I'm not, your point in asking of where we're at with the health of the inns has to do with
Well, we're
restricting
talking-
uses?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about limiting no more inns or no more this or no more that, I want to know the state of that particular economy in our town.
Okay. Well, in this case, we're specifically talking about in the RSC, and those aren't allowed in there and have not been for some time, the inns, that inn use. So, yeah, that's, plus that's kind of a use that against the residential does not typically work well.
And on that lot, I don't think you could really cram too much in there, but
And restaurants. Restaurants aren't truly compatible with residential backing up to it. I remember when Bouchon went for their expansion, because they were already there, and the Maison Fleur, the
Fleury.
bed and breakfast in back.
Yeah, Maison Fleury.
There were some issues around noise, which was valid. I think that there's a lot of noise that happens in the garbage area, and
Well, since then, they've been closed their kitchen, and those have been ironed out and worked through. We do have two inns that are in Petit Logis and Maison Fleury, been there a long time. Those are pretty small, and that's another factor, is usually the inns require bigger parcels than what we have in that strip, that veneer of RSC along Washington and Yount. They tend to be smaller lots.
I would actually think that inns are a more compatible use with a residential scale use than, say, restaurants, just because of the nature of what inns do. I mean, they're establishments for sleeping, and as opposed to the noise that's still generated from a restaurant. I mean, you have that clash. Essentially, you said your residential scale, commercial is about the scale of the buildings, but it's also the scale of the use, too, I think. And those two things are intertwined. So I would say an inn potentially would have more of a compatibility than a restaurant, both from the rooms and
depends, yeah.
the parking and from and noise.
We had functions at inns that have conflicted and that we've ironed out. But
And, you've had
Mr.
what?
Winterberg, I think I interrupted you earlier,
I did as well.
and so I think you're waiting to finish asking
too,
your
I
questions. So I'd like to suggest we allow you to do that.
So has there been interest in that parcel? I know we're talking about a global kind of idea of changing some language, but we're also talking about one piece of land.
Which one are we talking about?
The one between,
Summerston.
Summerston and the market.
Well, we understand that that parcel is recently sold.
That's
but
what
that
Bruce
the-
Peters said in one of these public hearings.
The owners really seem as if they've bought it to sit on it. They don't have any immediate development plans. So who knows when we'll see something there.
Okay. Then I guess that's all for my questions.
Ready to summarize your opinions so we can send them on to
Yeah.
council?
Yeah, sure. And I'll start since. I actually really like this use of the word diversity versus local survey. I think that is something that we can use more in the use permit process, because I think we can look at what else we have in town and talk about use diversity versus local surveying, which is harder to quantify. You can easily say, do you serve wine? Yes. No. Okay, no. So you're different than a lot of the places. Do you serve food? Yes. No. Okay, no. So you're different from a lot. And you can look at diversity from that way. So I kind of, I encourage that, that type of language to be kept in there. I'm totally against the local serving language because I think it's so vague at this point, and all the reasons everybody else has commented on. I still am one of the proponents here that I think we should work on incentives. I was looking at what other towns do in a quick Google search, and I came up with what Aspen's doing and what Lyman's doing in Colorado and what Moraga's doing in California. I just was looking around, and a lot of them use kind of the same tactics. They're not all obviously the same issues that Yountville has, but I saw a lot of the things such as giving the rebates, the tax rebates, giving cuts on fees, and I know each one of these things affects us financially as a town. But I also think it would be a way for us to get some maybe incentive for somebody else to come in versus another tasting room on that Rossi property, another tasting room on the property there that those people have just bought. So I would be in support of something along those lines. Another thing that Lyman did, which was helping with kind of interest-free loans, so businesses could come in and get the cash more easily up front to develop, and then over time they'd pay back. I think all of those ideas are the types of things we want to look at for getting something in there that's at least a little bit different. Yeah, I'm not a fan of the changing the FAR or setbacks or anything like that for the same reasons that you said, Bob. I think that covers most of what I saw. Oh, there was one thing that I do want to, it hasn't come up yet, but I think the redevelopment is going to be, I mean, as we talk about being built out at this point, I think redevelopment is going to be a big issue. I mean, right now we're talking about this one piece of property, but, what happens if, that the bank, not Wells Fargo, but the other local bank, West America ends up going away. Then what goes in there? And then we're going to have a whole bunch of other issues that come in. And I think anybody who comes into a property like that, we should really be kind of talking about all these things again, and diversity and changing that up. So I just want to bring that to the front again. Of course, my big thing is also about any kind of green or sustainable development as well for those redeveloped properties. That's all.
Mr. Gates, do you have anything to add to your earlier comments?
No, nothing further.
Mr. Anglin?
I would be interested in incentives if I kind of knew what the incentives were for. I think some of those towns that you're talking about were offering incentives for businesses just to come in, just to grow the business sector of the town. I don't think that's something that we have to worry about. I think we have to identify what it is that we want to, as you say, incentivize, and then offer that. I wouldn't want to see that for local serving businesses because, as I said earlier, I don't think that exists anymore. And so maybe it's for diversity. So, Rob had his checklist, and I think it's not serving wine, so that's diverse. It's not serving food, that's diverse. That's diversity. So, maybe something, I mean, as a raw idea, it's not a bad idea to develop on, wherever that may go. But I'm not, the incentives have to be for a specific goal that you have in mind, and I don't think that we need to bring businesses in by giving them breaks, because we certainly have enough people that want to do business here. So we're not in that situation. And I already said what residents serving commercial, my feelings about that. So I think I will turn it over to you.
I just have one question before I summarize my opinions. Bob, this touches on some of the things you've discussed. Has it ever been the case where zoning changes have been considered a taking?
Yes.
So that's something to be cautious of.
The so-called inverse condemnation,
Yes,
downzoning.
taking without just compensation. It's not just physical
Right.
taking of the property, but rendering it useless.
Mhm.
So that's an important consideration. So I will summarize my opinions. One, I think you're quite right to preserve the residential scale design aspect of the zoning. Two, I think the difficulty is the uses need better definitions. This is touched on in the staff report. What are the various businesses that we may call a restaurant, a wine bar, or retail? In addition, and this is really the crux of my recommendation, I think we need to separate allowed uses, which may be limited to something no more than retail, from conditional uses. Having a list of conditional uses, which I would say everything that's not retail, whereas industrial is prohibited, that allows for the incentives to become the nature of the business can be, if you will, a fining to make a certain business operation be conditioned to be allowed. Again, a conditional use is something that discretionary. It can be allowed, but it's not required to, like an allowed use. So I think that neatly solves the issue of what's an incentive, because it's quite right. I don't think there should be any incentives that alter the physical infrastructure of the property. The building and the parking lots will abide, the use won't necessarily. I'm in complete agreement to delete local serving from any requirement. It's my opinion that while it was well-intentioned, it's been an abject failure. It's further my opinion that the so-called retail diversity is just the flip side of that same coin, trying to shoehorn in an outcome that's sort of desired by a tool that's just not going to work. I think the idea of better definitions of uses and conditional uses through the use permit process can be a much more effective way to do this. Next to last, if there is and continues to be a strong demand for local serving, and I think I've said this before, there's only one way that will occur, and that's for the town to become a landlord. And that might be something the citizens of this town would like to see, the town to become a landlord and remove the need to make money on owning a business, but merely to cover costs. And the town as a landlord could decide to rent to a shoe repair facility or whatever the case may be. But we mustn't kid ourselves. The only way to change the nature of the businesses that want to be here are a significant interjection of the government into the marketplace. And I think the only real way that can happen is to carve off a part of the community center and say, this is open for a pharmacy if someone will come in here at a reduced rent. if the people in the government really want that to happen. That's the only effective way I could see it. Lastly, on page 2 of 4 of the staff report, you provided a list of 4 alternatives for discussion. I may be repeating myself, but I am firmly against 1, 3, and 4, and number 2 I give a conditional yes to the extent that I've described this allowed in conditional uses. That summarizes all of my stuff. Thanks very much, and I think we get to move on to 7.2. Yes?
Let's see. Yeah. There it is. It's a shiny screen. Okay. This is an introduction to a topic that's been presented to the council, and there's going to be more discussion to follow, and we'll probably bring this back to the ZDRB. It has to do with how effective the current open space standards and FAR standards are working for commercial districts. And some of these slides are more what FAR is. Floor area ratio is the ratio of the building's floor area against the size of the parcel it sits on. So if you had a 10,000 square foot parcel and 50% FAR, you get 5,000 square feet of building floor area. And this is more of how it's calculated in our system. We measure FAR from exterior faces of exterior walls, center lines of party walls. We have exclusions for floor area, in counting floor area in certain cases, uncovered areas used for off-street parking spaces, loading areas, access ways, areas which qualify as usable open space, arcades, patios, similar open areas, which are located at or near street level, and then architectural features, which is defined in our zoning ordinance. Now, this list is abbreviated compared to the exclusions we allow in residential. We exclude interior staircases, and for instance, in residential. And then there's some exclusions that are allowed in the commercial, but it's not clear. Like you get 250 square foot for a balcony. Now, but when you have a cluster of buildings, is that per building or is that the entire complex, which isn't a lot of exclusion, 250 square feet for those types of features. And the idea behind it is they want to increase the architectural complexity of the building and interest of the building by allowing balconies and upper floor features that project and are open and breaks in the roof line. And limiting it to 250 square feet is perhaps not achieving the amount of interest that they could. So that's something that would need to be clarified. So FAR, it serves the function of limiting the building size when used with height and parking and open space and setbacks. There's other types of ways of limiting building size. Some cities employ a coverage where you get 35% you can cover of the lot. Usually the rationale behind that is to control the amount of pervious surface that's that's being, for stormwater drainage reasons, that's being allowed on the site. There's other more sophisticated, nuanced provisions of FAR to where any, where you have a cathedral ceiling and say a living room, if you go over varies 12, 14 feet, even though it's open all the way to the ceiling, it will get counted as though there's a floor, an imaginary floor in there, regardless of whether it's open or not. And the reason for that is to control building size. You could have a huge building that's just cathedral ceilings everywhere, but it has a lower floor area ratio. In the case of Carmel, California, they use a volume measurement, and they're measuring cubic feet inside the building. I've speculated the reason that is that they have a lot of ocean view issues to where every cubic foot becomes important to somebody behind you trying to get their view of the ocean. So they go through that calculation, and they claim it's easy to do, but I don't necessarily believe that. That seems like a lot of calculating. So let's see, what else do I have here? Limits the amount of building floor area, but not necessarily coverage. However, permeable portions of the site are necessary for stormwater management. This is some general statements that higher FAR result in a more compact urban form and walkable urban features. You've densified the urban form, the European city model, to where it encourages more pedestrian use, more public transportation use. These are FARs of over 300%. They produce those kind of like the classic little narrow street with the 4, 5, 6-story buildings that give you this sense of enclosure in a European city that everybody finds charming. And our model in the United States has been one more of urban sprawl, where the cheaper land's always at the edge, at the hinterland, and you go out there and the so-called do your development there, and services have to be run out there, and then the next, the so-called leapfrog development, to where they're leaping beyond that for the next cheaper land, and then it is a sprawl feature to where it's difficult to service that, and public services and utilities and fire and police, and we've realized that now, and most cities have implemented urban growth boundaries and urban limit lines to contain the growth within a serviceable area. So our commercial standards in Yountville are generally 25% for commercial, with an initial 15% for residential uses that are devoted, the 15% strictly to residential. You can't use that as part of the commercial and, fill a couple of apartments and end up with 32% commercial. And so it's really 25% for the commercial portion. You go down to or up to Healdsburg or St. Helena, and you look at their very compact downtown, 100%, 200% perhaps, where they're covering the entire lot and the second floor, and the buildings are sharing walls. So they're a much more compact urban form. We don't have that here. We're more of a strip commercial type of development, lineal, 25%, and you're required to have your own off-street parking as opposed to public parking that you find outlying the downtown and areas like St. Helena, Healdsburg. So just some questions here to do. Is what we are doing working well for us? Are there other means by which to assess and evaluate building mass? Our commercial FAR standards, do they penalize outdoor uses, including trash areas? Now, those get counted, the trash areas, screen storage, outdoor use areas that get counted as FAR. Our FAR definition extends beyond, takes a departure from the strict square footage of a building, and we start counting things that are outdoor use areas. We count outdoor seating areas at restaurants as though they were building floor area, and it gets counted against their limit. We count to the exterior of the building, and we, in some cases, found that penalizes the use of higher quality exterior material like rock. And if someone chooses to go with a higher R factor in their wall with a deeper cavity, they're getting penalized because they're going to the exterior of the wall and they're providing that extra depth using some other exotic material to clad the outside. That's getting penalized. So it, in that way, acts as a disincentive for the use of those other materials. So we're suggesting having a look at that, of how we measure to the exterior, maybe go to center of plate or even the interior. Residential uses have a greater number of items that are exempt from, okay, I already mentioned that. Commercial uses, I mentioned the 250 square feet of unenclosed porches, balconies, attached carports, breezeways, similar architectural features. And that this is a small allowance for, particularly when you take a building like the spa at Bellagio. That's a big building, and they have a few balconies on that, and upper floor patio or landing areas. If you counted only 250 square feet for that entire site, it would not encourage those features. So that would be something I think we would want to encourage and allow almost as an exemption outright. So these are ideas we're going to be bringing back to you for your consideration. Let's see where we're at.
Bob, if I understood you earlier, this is more, hey, guys, start thinking about this?
Yeah.
Is that your goal tonight, not to...
Correct. And then moving into open space. Open spaces in commercial areas is just a standard that we found almost impossible to achieve. And we strain every time. We're counting little planter areas in the parking lot. And when you figure you take half of the site and devote it to parking, you take 25% of the site and devote it to the building, usually footprint, and they're wanting another 25% of usable open space for to achieve that standard. It's really difficult, if not impossible. And we just, almost in every case, take a lot of liberties trying to meet that number, and then frequently are asking for an exception under the master development plan process. So I think that's something that really needs a lot of thought of what we're trying to achieve with that, and maybe lower that, and not maybe even get away from a percentage and talk more about quality of the features rather than amounts necessarily. Some of them do come in, like in the case of the new R&D kitchen, they're providing an expansive Bosque area that works well with their outdoor seating and is an amenity for them as well. And it, by coincidence, achieves our open space objectives. But on a small lot like, say, Summerston or even Hotel Luca, it's just really tough to come up with that. So these are some points I've already raised about how the lot gets consumed up quickly, and how realistic the 25% is. So what did I have here? So I think what's being suggested is not so much a modification of the percentages that are required for FAR, but how it gets counted and what gets counted. And these are some ideas I've already mentioned about measuring to the center of the plate or some other measurement, exempt outdoor storage and trash areas, count outdoor use areas. I think it is valuable to count outdoor use areas such as the outdoor restaurant seating, but perhaps at a weighted percentage where we would count it also as open space, which it is. And we for the area provided, 65% of that area would count towards the FAR and 35%. And these are not locked in, but these are just ideas. 35% of that area would go towards open space. So it's a percentage over percentage. Sure. Limit outdoor use areas by available parking space to service the area. And reduce the open space percentage requirement to be proportional to the lot size on a sliding scale. With the smaller the lot, they'll reduce the requirement. If it's a percentage, we're still sticking with. It's a little easier on bigger lots to come up with open space, but on real small, tight lots, it's hard. Exempt outdoor use areas that are used only on an intermittent basis. I forgot what I was thinking on that one, but I will remember later. And increase these commercial FAR exemptions to be more in line with what we offer to residential. And that's it.
On an intermittent basis, do you mean like a tasting room who might sometimes serve wine outside?
I think maybe, yeah, like a patio where they occasionally have a mixer, but it's not a real use area in the sense that there's seating out there, and if that's what I meant. I'll have to go back over my notes and try to figure out what I was thinking.
And then like for Hotel Luca, you consider that central courtyard their open space?
Yes, parts of it. They have seating for the restaurant and another part that was counted against their FAR.
Okay.
It's out there.
I didn't find anything in that objectionable at all.
Nope.
I think you're really
thought it was
on the right
excellent.
track. The very first point said, is the current system working? More or less, yes. I do think the zoning, rather the design ordinance, talks about the advantage of a restrictive FAR, but sort of a permissive envelope is a greater variety of buildings and maybe more small buildings. And I think that has worked well, that John Phil is more a collection of buildings, and I think we want to preserve that. The various things that could be done better, I don't think anyone else could know them as well. You've been fighting with them, as you say, for 9 years, and they're probably all on the right track. But I think the basic outline of the system's solid, just updating it as you propose.
I think FAR came about in the 30s, 20s and 30s, about providing light and air to the street in downtown areas. And so it was about bulk. And so we're not using it in the same way here, I don't think. Because, well, we are in a way. We're limiting the amount of bulk. But the open space, I think, is kind of an issue. Just because this town is a series of small buildings on lots with open space all around it, like yards, more of a residential nature than an urban nature, like St. Helena, Calistoga, Healdsburg. So I think some of the ideas that you proposed in terms of the open space is not counted as a penalty, like in restaurants, that it actually, there is a weighting to it. And that as far as the FAR, but also open space is part of it too. I think that's a really interesting idea, as Jason said. I think that in general, the FAR system works. I think that some of the landscaping requirements are a real push. I wouldn't want to see the FAR get more dense. I wouldn't want to see it go higher. I think that scale-wise, people are able to work with it. I think that, like you said, the landscaping is an issue. in that open space. Is parking considered open space? No, it's a requirement, and then there's the 25% over and above that requirement of land covered by parking, right?
And even some of the notions of that it'd be accessible to the public at all times, and that got in, in Summerston, they have that roof deck, and that there was a whole long discussion about they wanted to have a gate to limit their liability of keeping people off of the deck at 3 in the morning, whatever, and there was initially a gate between the two buildings at the front as well, and that was early done away with as seen as limiting the public's access. But I think that needs to be examined, what the public interest is and private liability as well, of allowing the public onto private property and in all of these areas all the time, worth a discussion. And that what you mentioned about the bulk, it tends to, in conjunction with our setbacks and height, work to limit the mass of a building. But there are other cities that have whole separate calculations on called bulk plane mass, where they go up whatever 15 feet, and then they take off at a 45-degree angle, and they're trying to push the upper floors back from the street so it's not a canyon effect, and you end up with kind of a wedding cake configuration on the buildings that move the mass back as you go up. We don't need that here so much, but.
Right.
And I wasn't clear. So for like Summerston, do we do the count of that two-story area as the doubled space, so to speak? Since we're doing the covered area, right?
The two-story in the two-story building or the roof garden?
The two-story in the two-story building, because they have that nice atrium, basically, of their main entryway is 2 stories tall. And does that get counted?
No. No, we don't have that. And, where it kind of came up, it wasn't a problem until it occurred to me that in Washington Park, you have a model house there that's 2-story, and they have the big open living room. Right. And people then were starting to, for those that could do it, some of them could put a floor in there and end up with another bedroom above. They had to change out the windows for operable. But then it kind of dawned on me, well, like, what are we doing if it's floor area, now, but it didn't get counted as floor area because it was open. And I started researching around, and some cities get around that by just saying, if it's more than 12 feet, we're going to count as though there's a floor up there. And that limits, because really it's surcharging the mass of the building by not counting it as part of the FAR. Something we may want to think about.
Well, with residential in particular, the FAR standards give a great benefit to a 2-story house. A stairway is exempt, as you noted. A stairway, in my opinion, is just a vertical hallway. But on a 1-story house, a hallway counts. Mm-hmm. And what you're talking about, I've long thought that the way to discourage 2-story houses is not this capricious number per block, but just to reward single-story homes rather than reward 2-story homes. If, in fact, the goal is to not have all 2-story houses. But right now, we reward them. I mean, my house is 2-story for exactly that reason, that the stairway didn't count.
And some of these very small lots you find in Old Town, they can be nothing but 2-story, really, to get any kind of usable area in them.
Mm-hmm. So, anyway.
So basically what we do is square foot then, right? For the FAR.
Square feet of the floor area with some exemptions for staircases and chimneys and some other features like that.
But you could also have an amendment or a covenant in the development agreement that they can't develop that into another, they can't expand the space that they already have.
You could, but see, that's not getting at what I think is the loophole. What I think the loophole is, if you're using FAR to control the size of a building and make it appropriate to its site, you're trying to relate it to the size of the parcel it sits on, if you're not counting big soaring rooms inside, then you've allowed all that mass without counting it. But if they were to come in and later somehow, put a floor in, what's the difference? You're not seeing it from the outside.
Don't your plate height and building height restrictions for 1- and 2-story buildings sort of address that? That a 1-story building can only be 18 feet tall to the peak with X to the ridge, and a
Right.
2-story building is taller?
Yeah.
So it seems to me why doesn't that solve this problem?
Well, in these cases, it's the design of the house is the great room, or whatever you want to call it, the big high ceiling room is kind of tied in with the upper floor bedrooms that go up a staircase, and they're there. So it is, for the most part, for the large percentage of it, a 2-story house. So you get the increased plate height.
Okay.
It would
As opposed to just a single-story building that happened to have 20-foot plates.
yeah.
We don't look at it as
I
portions
underst-
of buildings connected to.
I understand.
a whole.
Because then they have to drop down the plate line, and they couldn't have the big.
Well, the footprint would be smaller if you eliminated that 2-story space and you just took the square footage of the first floor and whatever was on the second floor and then condensed that into a 2-plate system.
Right. That gets complicated.
I know, but it would be a large reduction in
Yeah.
the mass of the building.
Stop what I guess I'm concerned about, or
You just wouldn't have 2-story spaces, 2-story open spaces.
And, I suppose that there's nothing wrong with having the big cathedral ceiling if they're willing to expend a part of their square footage in FAR in an imaginary plane that's cutting through there. They just opened it up.
So you would maybe feel that you'd want to impose some imaginary plane at some height.
Yeah, after,
to-
say,
to-
14 feet, 12 feet.
I think it would have to be higher than that, because you couldn't have you couldn't have legally 2 rooms of 7 feet, right? What is
Structure, yeah.
7'6" minimum head height, and that's and 7 foot for a bathroom. So I think but maybe, as you say,
I
the
see
numbers
where
aren't
you're going, yeah.
the numbers aren't locked in, but I think it's higher than 12 or 14 feet. Rob just mentioned the support structure itself is going to eat up a foot.
Yeah, maybe it's not so much the idea that you're stopping them from stacking another floor in there that's of illegal head height. It's just the mass question, that
Okay.
once they start going up like that, and maybe your trigger is better, that's why they would do it to begin with. I mean, no other reason, but you still have the mass. This is an 11, approximately, the ceiling in this room is 11 feet. So if it were going up to 12 or 14 and then you impose the restriction, you're controlling the mass of the building by, it could go on up to 20 feet, without being counted as FAR.
But let's take Washington Street, where the Sorrento is, and then across the street is the Spa. Scale-wise, that seems to be about right. The buildings are 2-story buildings on both sides of the street. Scale-wise, it works. The little building that's at the Summerston, that's next to the bank, or Piazza Quercia, is a nice transition from that. I think it works okay. The bulk doesn't seem out of place to me
Yeah,
at all.
I suppose the flip side of that is my opinion that perhaps our commercial FAR is too low, and that doesn't bother me. They have the taller ceilings in those because they're operating with a pretty minimal, for a commercial building, FAR. So,
And I think that I do want to I think there's a difference between residential and commercial, for sure, when we're talking about this, because residential, I mean, that's basically that person's private space, so it's going to be a little different, but I really take into account not only external massing, but internal space. And I don't want to penalize somebody like, just using Summerston as an example, I think that's great to have an open spaced room versus having just two 8-foot ceilings stacked on top of each other. So I also don't want to overly burden that aspect of it either. I think we talk about external, massing, but I think also internal space is important as well. So I wouldn't want to, penalize them because they chose to have this large internal space by, double counting it and saying, well, you could put a floor there, so I'm going to count that against your FAR as well. To me, that seems overly restrictive.
But see, I think a lot, as I was thinking what you're saying, I forgot the fact that what we're looking at is Summerston backs up to a residential area, and so there needs to be that sort of transition. So increasing the FAR would make bigger buildings, and you wouldn't want that in that transitional zone there. I mean, maybe across the street, the inn could be larger, but it is a transitional zone, and as you pointed out, it needs to be sensitive to not only the use in the residential area, but also the bulk and scale of it. Mm-hmm. And so, in those areas, I wouldn't consider increasing the FAR there. I think the FAR works okay there. It's a good kind of mediation between the residential and the other side of Washington Street.
I'm going to go ahead and reveal that I don't have all this entire thing memorized and ask a question, which is, do we have different FARs on different commercial zones?
Essentially, they're 25% through.
So that could
through all
be
zones.
another possibility, is by talking about the different zones, the residential scale commercial might want to remain with a lower, but we might increase another portion of the town. Is that an option you've thought about? More work for you?
Well, I think going in, we weren't really looking at tweaking the numbers on the amounts themselves, more how it's counted, I suppose. And, the whole idea, we got off in this long discussion of this example I gave you.
Yes. Don't make that mistake again, Bob.
I'm not sure that I even, that's going to appear as a suggestion later that we just leave that one alone. But, yeah, I didn't mean to make more of that point then. Know that we've got runaway bulk and mass going on because of the FAR, the way it's figured.
So we need to think about this more, and then this subject's going to come back for some maybe formal
Yeah,
recommendations.
maybe I'll bring back some more refined, distilled suggestions of what we would change in the ordinance.
But
Well,
I think
I-
there's a general consensus that the bulk of that at minimum is really on the right track. Do we agree?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you guys deal with it every day. And so you see where it works and where it doesn't work. And so I think your list is a good start. Because I think those are some of the issues that people coming into town to try and develop struggle with, and you struggle with it. And
Well, I'll throw out something that I struggle with and that perhaps I would like to see go. It's the FAR that applies to outdoor use areas. And we're not talking building mass, we're talking about an area that can be, the open space standards that can apply to. And if it is a use area, we can apply a parking standard to it. But it discourages lively urban areas with outdoor seating and uses like that when we're not talking about a building. So is FAR how we want to regulate outdoor use areas? I think it was a mistake that we started looking at it in those terms because all of our restaurants are tied to that standard now.
Right.
But
Can't
is there a?
encourage
Yeah, I
outdoor
agree.
seating and then discourage it through,
Yeah.
kind
When there
of
may be
different-
another way to regulate the impacts through parking and still require a minimum amount of open space to get the balance that we want.
There would be a question about what is substantially enclosed. When a trellis suddenly has clear plastic waterproofing covering on it, and
Yeah.
and so that I think that would be difficult for you. But before we beat this, I think we've beat this into the ground.
Could I do one more while
Are
I'm
you
at it.
sure?
You sure you want to do another example?
I just remembered, Senator said that, one thing that we've been carrying along as a sort of a guideline, unwritten as it is the idea of when something, and it's Bouchon, I'll get straight to the example of the lesson learned, is that Bouchon has that outdoor seating between the restaurant and the bakery, and that is, anyone's eligible to walk up, sit down, you don't have to buy anything, you can read a newspaper, bring your own sandwich, I guess, if you wanted to. And they don't shoo you away, it's open to the public. So it's public, usable, open space that's accessible. But if there were seating out, table service out there, and then it becomes a use area, and then it switches from being counted in the open space category as that 25% to now it's counted against FAR. And it's a big flip because on Summerston, the notion of where service was happening on that site, they were right on the razor's edge on both of those calculations. And if you then started closing something off and it became a use area, then you got a skew on the other, in deficit on one and in surplus on the other, because each one was in balance. And that's something, when we come back, that I want you to consider that whole notion of the idea of when something becomes just along the lines of what Sandra is saying. We want to encourage that vitality on the street and not penalize someone because they have people sitting at a table out there, and whether they're being served or not, maybe that's an essential difference, I don't know. But it's being used either way. And our guideline has been that if it's open and anybody can go and sit there, then it's open space. And if you're getting table service there and it's some otherwise, say, exclusive table service area, it's designed for customers only, then it's an FAR.
Well, it's interesting because I think that Bouchon has it both ways. So during the day, they have
They do.
that area open, and at night, they use it as service area.
Yes.
And so you've got both things.
That might be that intermittent use of outdoor areas.
Right. Maybe that's what I meant.
Yeah, that's it. That's what it is.
Good save.
Yeah.
Any staff reports? Any board reports? Shall we adjourn?
So, can I just ask a question?
Certainly.
So what projects are on the boards right now?
Well, at the next council meeting will be R&D's kitchen and ad hoc expansion. Mainly those two.
So Vita or whatever that place is dead.
They have until the end of the year to pull a permit and commence work, or they lose their entitlement for the use.
And then how about Gordon's? What's the status of Gordon's?
Gordon's has an operator that's committed to working on the restaurant. He's busy with Crush right now, and will turn his attention to that and operate the use with his sons as a restaurant.
Cool. Not a tasting room, but a restaurant.
Well, they had tasting there before. You know, it was a
Gordon's,
tasting
yeah,
bar.
I remember that. Yeah.
But that's not the focus of what they intend it
It's
to
going to be primarily food,
be. Yes.
like Sally Gordon's was.
Is there any more talk about the outdoor lighting project at New Marketplace in the corral there? Did that come back?
They'll be coming
delayed.
to the council, the first meeting in January. And what
They
was
have to
the
come back here
reason
with
for
their
that?
plans first?
No,
And I had another question.
Because
Oh,
I
I'm
don't
sorry.
think we're very keen on their plans when they were here before. With the posts and the droopy lights.
Oh. Right, they would have to do a design and iron that matches the fence, but that could be approved administratively depending on what they submit.
And better lights. Rob wanted
It looked
better
like they were
lights.
going to come back with that and better lights.
I would suggest they go look at the lighting at Maison Marie.
Yeah.
outdoor lighting there, which I called to Robert's attention when we were up there for the art thing. That's the way to do it.
Tivoli lighting, or whatever they call it.
It's the,
Well,
it's the more, it's
Strung
larger.
on cables, so it's not just drooping, they've got
Right.
iron posts.
They've
built-
committed to that.
Built in, it's first class all the way.
And the project that is next, the Rossi wanted to redevelop that apartment building, is that dead too, or, because there was a lot of kind of comments about the parking situation, shared parking with Thomas Keller's office building there.
I think the potential operator of that site is considering whether it's
Worth the fight.
worthwhile to move forward. But with the RSC zoning in place, it opens the option for it.
And while we're at it, McGrath's garage, that
I
property
think they were
is-
waiting on the election, and we haven't spoken with them since.
The guy, when he was here at the meeting that we had, he said that he had until December to exercise his option, so she's trying to figure that one out. Okay, that's
No
it.
word.
Okay.
We're adjourned.
We're out of here.
Thanks very much. Good night, everybody.
Thanks. Thank you for my